At 7:46 in the evening on July 31st, 2226, the ground west of Naples, Italy, heaved with the most violent shaking that modern instruments have ever recorded at one of the most dangerous volcanic systems on Earth. Buildings cracked and, in some cases, collapsed. Part of a cliff crumbled away. People were injured. 500,000 residents living directly on top of a vast, restless volcanic caldera felt the earth lurch beneath their feet. And thousands of them poured into the streets in fear, many spending the night sleeping in their cars or in emergency shelters rather than return indoors. Because this wasn't just any earthquake. This was the strongest tremor ever recorded at Campi Flegrei since continuous scientific monitoring began. A genuine, modern record at a place that scientists watch more closely than almost anywhere on the planet. So today, we're going to break down exactly what just happened, why it matters, and crucially, because this is a topic drowning in fear, the honest truth about what this record-breaking earthquake does and does not mean. And I promise you the accurate version, not the panic version. Because Campi Flegrei is one of those names that sends the internet into a doomsday frenzy. And the reality is both serious and more nuanced than the scariest headlines. So let me give it to you straight. But before we dive in, do me one quick favor because it genuinely helps this channel. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. And if you're anywhere near Naples or have ever visited that beautiful part of Italy, let me know. My thoughts are with everyone shaken by this. And if you want the calm, accurate breakdown of these events instead of the internet doom machine, hit that subscribe button. It's free. It takes 1 second. And it means you'll always get the truth over the hype. A thumbs up helps push this out to more people who deserve the straight facts. All right, let's get into it. Let me start with the most important thing right up front, because I refuse to bury the honest truth beneath the drama. This record-breaking earthquake, as frightening as it is, does not mean that Campi Flegrei is about to erupt. Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, the scientists who monitor this system around the clock, have reported that there are no signs of an imminent volcanic eruption. So if you clicked on this terrified that a supervolcano is about to explode, let me ease that fear right now. That is not what the evidence shows. But, and this is why the story genuinely matters, the earthquake itself is real. It caused real damage and real injuries, and it's the latest and most powerful sign yet of a caldera that is unmistakably restless. So the danger here is genuine, but it's a different danger than the one the doomsday headlines suggest. Let's understand what actually happened. The earthquake struck at 7:46 p.m. local time on Friday, July 31st. It registered a magnitude of 4.7, and its epicenter was near the Solfatara crater at Pozzuoli, at a shallow depth of only about 3 kilometers. And that combination, a moderate magnitude at a very shallow depth directly beneath a densely populated area, is exactly why it hit so hard. It was, according to Italy's civil protection authorities, the strongest earthquake recorded in the area since continuous instrumental monitoring began, surpassing 2 magnitude 4.6 tremors that struck back in 2025. It was also described as the strongest quake felt in the entire Campania region in 40 years. So when the title says Campi Flegrei just shook harder than modern records have ever seen, that is literally precisely true. In the era of scientific instruments watching this volcano, there has never been a stronger jolt. The damage was significant. At least 21 people were injured, some sources reporting as many as 26, with a couple of them seriously hurt. Several buildings, mostly unoccupied structures, collapsed and part of a cliff crumbled away. The shaking was so strong across the region that it disrupted daily life dramatically. Rail service on the local Cumanas and Circumflegrei lines was suspended, and the port of Pozzuoli was closed, cutting off ferry service to the nearby islands of Procida and Ischia in the middle of peak summer tourist season. The quake was felt sharply not just in Pozzuoli, but across the entire Naples metropolitan area, and out on those islands, sending a wave of alarm through millions of people. And it wasn't a single event. The main shock was followed by an intense seismic swarm, a rapid-fire sequence of aftershocks. Seismographs recorded more than 60 aftershocks in the hours that followed, the strongest of them a magnitude 3.8 that struck around 10 p.m. in the Gulf of Pozzuoli, with dozens more tremors rattling through the evening and into the next day. Italy's civil protection minister warned that the seismic swarm was continuing and that further earthquakes above magnitude 3 remained possible. That relentless shaking is exactly why so many families chose not to sleep in their homes, a very reasonable precaution, because in the hours and days after a significant earthquake, strong aftershocks are most likely, and a building weakened by the main shock could be vulnerable. So thousands spent the night in their cars or in emergency gathering areas set up by the authorities. And Italy's government, including its deputy prime minister, pledged assistance to the displaced residents and a lasting plan to make the area's buildings safe. So that's what happened. Now let me give you the essential context. what Campi Flegrei actually is, because you can't understand the significance without it. Campi Flegrei, which translates from the Greek as the Phlegreian fields or burning fields, is not a single cone-shaped volcano like the famous Mount Vesuvius nearby. It's something bigger and stranger, a vast volcanic caldera, a huge depression in the earth formed by ancient colossal eruptions, measuring miles across and pockmarked with 24 smaller craters and volcanic features. It sits just about 9 kilometers west of the city of Naples, and only about 50 kilometers from Vesuvius. And here is the detail that makes it so significant and so closely watched. It is one of the most densely populated volcanic areas on the entire planet. Around 500,000 people live within the high-risk red zone, the 15 municipalities in and immediately around the caldera, and roughly 3 million people live in the wider Naples metropolitan area nearby. There is arguably no place on Earth where so many people live directly on top of such a large and active volcanic system. That is what makes Campi Flegrei one of the most important and most nerve-wracking volcanoes for scientists to monitor. And monitor it they do, with extraordinary intensity. Campi Flegrei is one of the most closely watched volcanic systems on the planet, observed around the clock by Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology through a dense network of instruments. There are seismometers detecting every tremor, no matter how small, GPS stations and satellite radar measuring. The grounds rise and fall down to the millimeter, and sensors constantly sampling the gases venting from features like the Solfatara crater, watching for chemical changes that might signal magma is on the move. This flood of data lets scientists track the caldera's behavior in fine detail and, critically, distinguish between the different possible causes of the unrest. It's precisely because of this comprehensive monitoring that experts can speak with real confidence when they say there are currently no signs of an imminent eruption. They're not guessing, they're reading a rich stream of real-time measurements. That intense scientific vigilance is one of the most reassuring aspects of an otherwise unnerving situation. If the caldera's behavior were to change in a way that genuinely signaled magma ascending toward an eruption, scientists would very likely see it in the data and be able to raise the alarm. So why is the ground shaking? This brings us to a fascinating and crucial concept called Bradysism, and understanding it is the key to this whole story. Bradysism is the gradual rising and falling of the ground surface over time, a slow-motion breathing of the earth. At Campi Flegrei, the ground literally rises and sinks over months and years, driven by the movement of fluids, gases, and magma beneath the surface. When the underground system pressurizes, as magma, or very importantly, hot hydrothermal fluids and gases accumulate and expand, the ground above swells upward. And here's the connection to the earthquakes. As the ground is pushed up and stretched, the rock strains and fractures, and those fractures are the earthquakes. So the seismic swarms at Campi Flegrei are, in large part, the sound of the ground being deformed and cracked by the pressure building beneath it. This current phase of Bradysism has been ongoing since around 2005, and it has been accelerating. Since it began, the ground near Pozzuoli has risen by more than 140 centimeters. That's over 4.5 feet of uplift. Think about that. Entire towns, streets, buildings, and harbors have been slowly lifted upward by more than the height of a person over the past 2 decades, and the earthquakes have increased right alongside that uplift. The seismic swarm that produced this record quake is part of a long-lived sequence that started weakly around 2015, intensified significantly in 2023, and has been pulsing with growing energy ever since, now culminating in the strongest ever recorded tremor. The caldera is, without question, in an active and restless phase. To understand how significant this is, and also to keep it in perspective, it helps to know that Campi Flegrei has been through an intense Bradysism crisis before, within living memory. In the early 1980s, from roughly 1982 to 1984, the caldera went through a dramatic episode of unrest. During that crisis, the ground rose at an astonishing rate, as much as 9 centimeters per month at its peak, and the area was rocked by more than 1,000 earthquakes in a single month at times. That crisis was so severe that authorities evacuated tens of thousands of people from the old center of Pozzuoli, and parts of the town were permanently altered by the uplift. The historic harbor rose so much that it changed the coastline. And yet, crucially, the 1980s crisis did not end in an eruption. The ground eventually stabilized and even sank back down for a time before the current cycle of uplift began in 2005. That history is genuinely important context for today because it shows 2 things at once. First, the Campi Flegrei is capable of alarming, disruptive unrest that forces evacuations and reshapes the land. And second, that such unrest does not necessarily lead to an eruption. It can escalate, cause real damage and displacement, and then subside. The current phase has been slower and more prolonged than the 1980s spike, but it has now produced a stronger single earthquake than that era did, which is exactly why it commands such attention. Now let's return to the honest calibration, because this is where responsible reporting matters most, and where I refuse to let this tip into doomsday territory. Given everything I just described, record earthquakes, ground rising by feet, an accelerating restless caldera, you might reasonably assume an eruption must be imminent. But the scientists who study this with far more data than any headline are clear that it is not. Here's the crucial nuance. A great deal of the evidence suggests that much of this current unrest is being driven not by magma rising toward the surface to erupt, but substantially by the hydrothermal system, the vast network of superheated water and gas beneath the caldera. As that hydrothermal system heats up and pressurizes, it can cause the ground to swell and the earthquakes to occur, without magma necessarily being on the move toward an eruption. In other words, the caldera can shake and rise like this from the plumbing heating up, not just from the fuel tank being about to blow. That's a critical distinction. And it's a big part of why INGV maintains that there are no signs of an imminent eruption, and why the official alert level has been set at a level of attention rather than alarm or evacuation. Let me expand on that distinction, because it's genuinely one of the most important and least understood parts of this whole story. Deep beneath Campi Flegrei, there is indeed a magma reservoir. That's what makes it a volcano. But sitting above and around that magma is a vast hydrothermal system. Rock saturated with water and gas that the deep heat keeps superheated and pressurized, a bit like the water in a giant buried pressure cooker. When magma at depth releases gases, or when that hydrothermal system heats up and pressurizes, it can push the ground upward and fracture the rock, producing uplift and earthquakes, without any magma actually moving up toward the surface. Scientists study the chemistry of the gases venting from the solfatara, the depth and character of the earthquakes, and the pattern of ground deformation precisely to try to tell these scenarios apart. And the current weight of evidence suggests the hydrothermal system and gas pressurization are playing a major role in the present unrest. This matters enormously because a caldera can shake and swell in this way for a very long time, years, even decades, driven by its hydrothermal plumbing without ever erupting. It's the difference between a kettle rattling as it heats and a kettle actually boiling over. Right now, the evidence points more toward a rattling, pressurized system than toward magma, making a final push to the surface. That doesn't rule out change in the future, which is why the monitoring never stops. But it's the honest, science-based reason the experts are watchful, rather than alarmed. There's another important piece of perspective. A magnitude 4.7 earthquake, while it's a record for the modern instrumental era at Campi Flegrei, is a moderate earthquake by global standards. In many parts of the world, a magnitude 4.7 would cause little more than a scare. What makes this one so impactful and so genuinely dangerous isn't its raw size, it's its location and depth. Extremely shallow, just a couple of miles down, directly beneath one of the most densely populated volcanic areas on Earth. So the significance here is really about geography and vulnerability, not about the earthquake being a monster in absolute terms. That's an important reframe, because it tells you that the primary immediate threat from this event is the shaking itself. The risk to buildings, the risk to the people living in them, the disruption to a huge urban area, rather than an eruption that the data simply doesn't support as imminent. But please, don't mistake that calibration for me saying this doesn't matter, because it absolutely does. Here's why this is genuinely serious, even without an eruption. You have 500,000 people living directly on top of a caldera that is now producing the strongest earthquakes in its modern record, with an ongoing swarm and more shaking expected. Many buildings in the area are old and were not built to withstand this kind of repeated seismic stress. Each significant quake can further weaken structures, and a densely packed urban area facing recurring earthquakes is a real and present hazard, not a hypothetical future one. Buildings collapsing, cliffs crumbling, people injured, thousands displaced, infrastructure disrupted. That's already happening from the shaking alone. So the danger is real. It's just important to be precise about what kind of danger it is. The immediate threat is seismic, the earthquakes and their effects on a vulnerable, crowded region. And the longer-term question of what the caldera might eventually do is one that scientists continue to watch with enormous care. So what should people in the region actually do, and what's the takeaway for the rest of us? For residents of the red zone, the guidance from authorities is what matters most. Stay informed through official civil protection channels. Know your area's evacuation plan, and heed instructions. In the immediate aftermath of a strong quake with an active swarm, the caution that so many residents showed, being wary of returning to potentially damaged buildings, staying in safe open areas, is exactly right, because aftershocks are most likely in the hours and days afterward. Earthquake basics apply. During shaking, drop, cover, and hold on, know where the safe spots and exits are, and have an emergency kit and a plan. And for the authorities, the record quake underscores the urgency of the ongoing work to assess and reinforce vulnerable buildings and to keep evacuation plans ready for a population of this size, an enormous challenge that Italy takes seriously. And that challenge is genuinely staggering when you think about it. How do you plan to evacuate 500,000 people quickly and safely from a densely built area with narrow old streets, limited exit routes, and a major city right next door? Italy does maintain emergency plans for exactly this, with designated evacuation zones and partner regions across the country prepared to take in displaced residents. But moving that many people in a hurry, especially if an evacuation had to happen fast, is one of the hardest problems in all of disaster management, which is part of why the earthquakes themselves happening now are treated with such seriousness. Beyond the logistics, there's a profound human dimension to all of this. The people of Pozzuoli and the surrounding towns have been living with Bradysism for years. The ground rising beneath their homes, the recurring earthquakes, the constant low-grade anxiety of not knowing what the caldera will do next. Many have already had homes declared unsafe. This record earthquake reopens and deepens that stress, forcing families to once again flee into the night, to sleep in cars, to wonder whether their home and their community are safe. That psychological toll, living in the shadow of an uncertain, restless giant, is a real and often overlooked part of this story. And it's why the residents deserve not sensational fear-mongering, but accurate information and genuine support. Here's the honest bottom line. On July 31st, 2026, Campi Flegrei was struck by a magnitude 4.7 earthquake. Genuinely the strongest tremor ever recorded there in the modern instrumental era. A real and significant milestone. It injured people, collapsed buildings, crumbled a cliff, disrupted a major region, and drove thousands from their homes, and it's part of an ongoing, accelerating phase of unrest at one of the most densely populated volcanic areas on the planet. That is serious, and it is genuinely frightening for the 500,000 people living on top of this restless caldera. But the scientists monitoring it closely report no signs of an imminent eruption, and much of the current unrest appears driven by the hydrothermal system and ground deformation, rather than magma racing toward the surface. So the immediate, real danger is the shaking itself, the threat to buildings and people in a crowded, vulnerable region, not the supervolcanic apocalypse the internet loves to imagine. This is a restless caldera being watched more closely than almost anywhere on Earth, doing something record-breaking and worthy of our full attention. But it is not, according to the evidence, on the verge of blowing up. And understanding that distinction is how you hold this story accurately, with concern, with respect, but without panic. I'm going to keep tracking all of it, the ongoing swarm, the monitoring data from INGV, the recovery in Pozzuoli, and everything the scientists learn about what's happening beneath this remarkable caldera. If you want the calm, accurate version instead of the internet doom machine, subscribe so you don't miss an update, because with a topic this surrounded by fear and misinformation, having someone give you the straight story is the whole point. Hit that like button to help this reach more people who deserve the truth instead of the hype. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and had you ever heard of Campi Flegrei before today? Tell me. I read every single one, and my thoughts are with everyone affected. I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there, and look out for one another.